Hello, welcome to the video review for What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray Rothbard. My name is Dr. James Yohe, and we'll get started. Now, Rothbard begins by talking about the origin of money, and he says that exchange, we're going to start from exchange, as the basis for society. That the reason we form towns and all these other things is in large part because of the benefits to exchange. The first type of exchange Rothbard talks about is direct exchange or barter. Individuals trade only for items that can directly satisfy their wants. No further trade is necessary to accomplish their goal. Now, barter has a number of problems. There is the double coincidence of wants problem, where the two traders have to possess the goods necessary for the trade and value them in a reverse order. So if I were going to trade you an orange for an apple, I would obviously have to value the apple higher than the orange in order to offer the trade and have the orange. You, on the other hand, would have to value the orange more than the apple and have an apple to trade. In that case, we could trade the orange for the apple. I would have the apple. I'm better off. I like the apple better than the orange I gave up in the exchange. You would have the orange. You're better off because you like the orange better than the apple that you offered up in exchange. Now, that double coincidence of wants problem is a serious hindrance to any sort of a complex economy under barter. There's also an indivisibility of goods problem. Large indivisible goods aren't made under barter because they can't be divided up without loss of value. And finally, we have as many different prices for a good as there are goods that trade against it. This prevents economic calculation, and that prevents us from knowing if what we produce is worth more or less than what goes into producing it in terms of the evaluations of our fellow man. And we don't know if we're creating or destroying wealth in society. Therefore, barter is not that big of an advancement. The important thing to come along is something called indirect exchange, which sounds like a roundabout method of getting where you want to go, but it is the discovery that allows man to develop sophisticated societies and economies. In this case, under indirect exchange, individuals trade for something that won't directly satisfy their want, knowing they can trade it for what they do want. So in this case, maybe I want an apple, but you don't want the orange, but you want a pear. So I would trade my orange for a pear that I don't want, then turn around, take that pear, and trade it to you for the apple that I do want. And that would be indirect exchange. The good that I trade for that I don't want, but I'm going to use to turn around and trade again for the apple or what I do want, in this case the pear, that is called a medium of exchange. Many different media of exchange might arise in a society, and they begin to compete against each other based on marketability, durability, divisibility into smaller units without loss of value, and transportability. And you can see the two sub-criteria, high value to weight ratio, and the thing can be formed into easy to manage shapes. So all of these media of exchange compete against each other based on that criteria, and through the subjective evaluations of individuals within that economy, one or two media of exchange win out and they become what we call money. Money is a universally accepted medium of exchange. As different societies with their own monies start to trade with each other, their monies compete, and eventually through this process, gold and silver won out as money worldwide. Now, money wasn't a currency. It was the weight of gold or silver in the coin. A dollar, for example, was originally a 1 ounce silver coin. When gold and silver become money, people need to keep it safe. Thus, they entrust it to people called goldsmiths. Goldsmiths had gold. They were able to keep it safe. So people naturally went to the goldsmiths and said, "Hey, can you keep my money safe?" And the goldsmiths would do this for a fee. And when you gave them your gold, say 10 ounces of gold, they would give you a receipt saying that you had 10 ounces of gold on deposit. These goldsmiths eventually become banks, and the receipts that they issue at this point are fully backed by gold, circulate eventually as substitutes for the money or money substitutes. So instead of taking your receipt, going to the bank, getting your 10 ounces of gold, driving to the next town, trading the 10 ounces of gold for a horse, the person you bought the horse from then having to take it down to his goldsmith and getting a new receipt, instead the receipts start to circulate. So I just take my receipt, you recognize it as a valid receipt, you accept it, deposit that into your bank. Now, that creates an issue. These bankers have to get together and settle their accounts or settle their receipts. So maybe every Friday the bankers meet and they say, okay, I've got so many of your receipts, you have so many of mine, and any difference between the receipts has to be made up in gold that comes out of their vaults. This isn't a problem as long as the receipts are fully backed. For every 1 ounce receipt, there's 1 ounce of gold in a vault somewhere. Some bankers realize that people don't necessarily care if they get the exact same gold coins that they deposited, and they realize that there is always a stack of gold in the vault that doesn't get redeemed. These bankers then start to issue extra paper tickets that are not backed by gold. So maybe a banker has 100 ounces of gold in his vaults. It never gets touched. He then issues an extra receipt for 10 ounces. Now he has 110 ounces in receipts backed only by 100 ounces of gold, and then lends this 10-ounce receipt out or banknote out at interest. These extra paper tickets that the banks issue, they become money. Banks with unbacked tickets are in a state, and that should say of, perpetual bankruptcy. They have more current liabilities, those are their banknotes, those are promises to give people their gold back, than they have current assets, gold in their vaults to back them. Now, this creates a situation that when customers lose confidence in their bank's ability to give them their money, they will then run to the bank and get there before the money is gone. And this is called a bank run. Banks that have made bad loans or banks where people lose confidence that their money is going to be returned to them for various different reasons will get run on. When the bank runs out of gold but still has unredeemed banknotes, they are what we call bankrupt. Now, these fractional reserve banks don't just have to worry about their customers running on them. They also have to worry about their competitors. Different banks might print notes faster than other banks. In this case, the banks that are printing or inflating at a higher rate than their competitors, when they meet up to clear receipts or banknotes, other banks will have more of their banknotes than they have for these other banks, and thus they'll have to bring gold to the clearing and give gold to the other banks. This will cause gold to drain out of their vaults through the clearing. If the bank doesn't halt inflating, this drainage of gold out of their vaults can cause them to go bankrupt. Banks and governments. So banks have their customers through bank runs and other banks to fear if they inflate too much. Governments get into the money game at first through monopolizing the mint and coin clipping. Originally, coins were privately minted. Miners would bring their gold to a minter who would then turn it into coins. By being in the form of a coin, this increased the value of the gold, and anyone could do it. Some minters were better than others. The dollar was originally a 1-ounce silver coin minted by a man called the Count of Schlick. He lived in Joachim's Thaler. People liked his coins. They trusted them. They were of the right fineness, size, quality, etc., and they were reliable, trustworthy. So people liked their coins. They originally started calling them Joachim's Thalers. That get changed to Thaler, and that eventually becomes the dollar in the U.S., Canada, and many other countries. And that was simply a name for a 1-ounce silver coin. Now, governments also can come to bankers' aids, to a banker's aid during a bank run and suspend specie payment, which means that the banks no longer have to follow their contractual obligation to redeem banknotes for gold temporarily. Now, another intervention happens in the rate of exchange between gold and silver. Gold and silver freely exchange against each other. Then the government comes in and can fix the price between gold and silver. In doing so, because silver is more plentiful than gold and easier to mine, the governments would generally overvalue silver, making that the bad money in Gresham's law, and undervaluing gold. Gold becomes the good money. This creates a Gresham's law problem where silver, the bad money, drives out gold, the good money, from circulation. This only occurs, bad money driving out good money, when there are fixed exchange rates between the two monies that overvalue one money, in this case silver, the bad money, and undervalue another money, gold in this case, the good money. Then bad money drives out good. Now this creates problems because there are contracts for gold coins. I lent you gold coins. The contract stipulates you have to pay me back in gold. But through running your business operations, you only get silver coins and you don't get enough gold coins to pay for all these contracts. To solve this problem created by fixing the exchange rates between gold and silver, governments created legal tender laws. In the US, $1 was a silver ounce coin, and it was comparable to $20, which was a 1-ounce gold coin. Those rates were fixed, and in this case, the dollars become legal tender. The government says you can pay your debts in either gold or silver dollars at the prescribed fixed exchange rates. By law, if you pay in dollars, say silver dollars, your creditor can't require you to pay in gold dollars because the dollar is now the legal tender, not the gold or the silver in the coins. A final intervention here before we go is central banking. Under central banking, a national bank is formed. This bank, in exchange for prohibiting or forbidding private note issue, they take away the ability to issue notes. The central bank then cartelizes the banking industry and acts as a lender of last resort for banks with redemption programs. A central bank cartelizes the banking industry by controlling note issue and ensuring a uniform expansion of the money supply. Now, I don't have the slide for that, but the original powers of the Fed were one, to set the reserve requirement ratio. This standardizes the ratio at which member banks can inflate by lending money out and creating checkable checking account balances out of thin air. The rate at which they can inflate on top of central bank note issue or reserve creation. Okay. Currently, that's 10%. Banks are required by law to hold about 10% of their deposits on reserve. So if the bank has $100 in checking account balances out there, those are deposits. They have to have at least $10 in their vault or on deposit at the Fed. The Fed issues the banknotes, controls the rate at which member banks can inflate through the reserve requirement ratio. They also act as a lender of last resort. If a bank doesn't have its reserve requirements, they can go out and borrow reserves from another bank or from a customer. Typically, they do it from another bank. Well, in times of uncertainty, banks may not be sure that have excess reserves that if they lend those to other banks that they'll get paid back in the morning. The bank may go belly up. So in this case, the banks that need reserves and can't get them on the market can go to the Federal Reserve and borrow through the discount window. And the Fed sets the discount window rate, the rate at which member banks can borrow from the central bank. And finally, the Federal Reserve has the what we call the open market committee operations. This is where most of the control over the money supply is done. And it is done through buying or selling assets, usually government debt. When the Federal Reserve wants to create bank reserves, which will get inflated on and create more money, they will buy usually U.S. government treasury debt from the public through their primary dealers. In this case, the Fed buys a bond from the bank and gives the bank a check. That check gets deposited into the commercial bank account for the primary dealer, goes back to the Fed, and the Fed says that that bank has X number of dollars in reserves. The bank can then lend out 90% of that, so forth and so on, until eventually $10 in checking account balances are created for every $1 in excess reserves. Now, originally, the Federal Reserve notes were backed by gold. You could take $20 back to the central bank, theoretically, hand it to them, and they would give you an ounce of gold. The Fed, of course, the Federal Reserve, when I say the Fed, the Federal Reserve, of course, created more notes outstanding than they had gold in the vaults to cover. The Federal Reserve is allowed to suspend specie payment, and in 1933 through 1934, during the Great Depression, the U.S. goes off the gold standard domestically. No longer could U.S. citizens and banks go to the Federal Reserve and redeem their dollars for gold. But internationally, central banks from other countries can redeem their dollar in gold still. So there's still a tie to gold between the dollar, still tied to gold for the dollar. This ends in the 1970s when the U.S. goes off the gold standard internationally, when Richard Milhous Nixon shuts the gold window for good. This is a short review, 20 minutes. Hope it helps. Thank you. Bye.